Please be advised that this episode may contain triggering and/or sensitive material for survivors.
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to our podcast. This is the Hope Discovered podcast by CommQuest, and with us today is Gina Bowers. Gina, how are you?
I'm doing wonderful. How are you?
I am doing absolutely fantastic. Let me make sure I get your title correct. You are the Rape Crisis Program Manager and a counselor at our Alliance office. Is that correct?
That's right.
Are you originally from this area, from the Stark County area? Or?
Yes, I am born and raised in Canton, just a couple minutes from this office here. Went to Glen Oak, right down the street, of course.
Oh, yeah.
And through CommQuest, it's been really great because I've been able to work in all the major cities in Stark County. So that's been really, really fun experience, too, to get to know all the different communities in this area that I grew up in.
Absolutely. That's fantastic. Mm-hmm. What... You know, I often ask when I talk to people from CommQuest, so many people are so dedicated, and it's always a curious thing to me. What brought you into this area of work? How did this become a focus for you?
Well, right now I am an outpatient trauma therapist as well as a program manager, and it's actually interesting. My story started before I came to CommQuest. I felt a calling to serve people in homelessness, and I did that in many different areas, from soup kitchens to clothing handout sites, shelters, transitional housing, and eventually permanent supportive housing. Mm-hmm. And so what I was noticing as I was going through those different services is that in the shelters, the homeless individuals weren't able to get comfortable. They just were very restless and uneasy, even though the shelter workers were wonderful. And they were just very hypervigilant or always aware. Yeah. And then when it came time to go to permanent supportive housing, my office was there where they lived, and I still saw that restlessness and mistrust and difficulty letting their guard down. And so what I realized is they didn't just have a housing challenge, they also had a trauma challenge that they were going through. And so when the program ended that I was working in, serving homeless folks, I was reassigned to different offices within the agency to do counseling. And I recognized then that I was seeing the same effect there with the folks that I was working with. I was working with survivors in the Rape Crisis Program, and I saw they, too, displayed the same symptoms. Mm-hmm. There's three major clusters of symptoms with post-traumatic stress disorder. The first is hyperarousal, being very jumpy, very, very jittery. The second is re-experiencing, where they have dreams, nightmares, flashbacks that are just really disturbing. And the third is just that numbing and avoiding, and I was seeing that. So I recognized I was working with trauma brain. Mm-hmm. And so the traditional therapies for that can be a little bit ineffective at times, I was finding. And so when I realized I was working with their inner brain, their amygdala, which is a very small part of their brain, I realized I had to get trained differently for that. So I got trained in some really specific therapy styles, and that's been really, really effective in working with folks that are experiencing trauma brain. Yeah,
the trauma brain. That's an interesting term. Can you just briefly let our audience know what that is?
Sure. For folks that have experienced overwhelming experiences, either through witnessing it firsthand or secondhand, or just feeling something's very overwhelming to them, the frontal lobe part of their brain, which is their forehead, is where our thinking brain is, that shuts down. And we actually regress to our inner brain, which is our emotional brain, our limbic system. And inside there is a very small piece of the brain called the amygdala. And that determines if we're scared and if we're safe or not. And a lot of times people live out of that amygdala of feeling not safe and moving through the world in that way. Yeah. And so it's a very difficult way to live through life. And that's a lot of times the folks that I'm serving are living through that. And so we have to adjust the way that we provide services to them.
Sure. I've read some of your things in one place or another, the one article that you wrote for the paper. And I one of the stats I wanted to bring up, that 1 in 3 women are potentially a victim of some sort of sexual violence, and 1 in 6 men. To me, that's a very high number. I don't know that most people are aware of that. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about that, how common it is?
Sure. It is a absolute crisis. Now, when we talk about sexual violence, I think it's helpful to define what we're actually talking about. And sexual violence is any unwanted sexual activity that someone did not give free and enthusiastic consent to. And so this is kind of a large umbrella of actual types of violence that can range anything from sexual abuse to sexploitation or sexual harassment. And so it's a very wide range of violations against a person. So when we say 1 in 3 or 1 in 6, what my colleagues and I in the sexual violence world see is that it's actually higher than that because this is the most underreported crime. So we try not to get too hung up on stats except for education in the community to let them know how prevalent this is. It's very serious and it's very real, and it's a lot more common than is actually discussed.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you about stigma. You made the comment that it's a very underreported crime. And there seems to be, and that's one of the reasons why I'm glad we're talking about this with you today, because so many times people are uncomfortable to talk about sexual assault, and I can certainly understand why, but by the same token, it just kind of puts the subject into the back room that much more. So therefore, a lot of times victims are reluctant to come forward. We've heard a lot about how victims are often blamed. You know, you invited this by wearing a certain type of dress or what have you. So as an advocate for victims and survivors, what are some of those misconceptions, and how would you encourage survivors to talk about their experience and come forward?
Well, stigma and shame are what I consider to somewhat be sisters to sexual violence because they always come along for the ride when there's sexual violence involved.
Yeah.
Stigma is one of the most powerful weapons that offenders use to take control of survivors. And so the act of sexual violence itself is one that's meant to bring shame and degradation to a person while simultaneously controlling their self-value. And by nature, it's designed to be completely secret and hidden. And so there's actually, interestingly enough, a name now that we have for the technique that many sexual offenders use to use stigma as a weapon. And the acronym is called DARVO.
Okay.
And DARVO stands for deny, attack, reverse, victim, and offender. And so what that means is first the offender will deny, then they will attack the credibility of the survivor and stigmatize them. And then they themselves will take on the role of the victim and say that the survivor is actually coming after them to ruin their character. We see this very commonly in mainstream media.
Yeah.
And so that's actually a term that's used because it's a very powerful technique. And when we as a society start by believing, we can reverse the power of that effect that sexual offenders use. And so that changes the narrative and shines a spotlight to not only be on the negative pieces of what has happened, but just empowers the survivor.
Yeah. That's interesting. I never really considered that, that it's in and of it and by itself, stigma is used as a weapon by perpetrators. I've read, and maybe you can speak about this, that with COVID-19, there's been an increase, let's say, in domestic violence. A lot of people are home a lot more than what they would be normally, and that's hard for anybody to get along, but especially someone who is prone to violence and is in that cycle. Can you speak a little bit about that? How has that impacted what you guys are doing out in Alliance?
I think it's important to look back historically at pandemics and situations like this because these are things that we've never lived through, especially my generation. We've never experienced this. So when we look back in history, the first documented pandemic and actual quarantining was in 532 AD. That was many, many, many years ago. But since then, there's been a lot of research done on pandemics for the past 2,000 years that state that whenever there's a pandemic or a natural disaster, like an earthquake, tsunami, or a large flood, it's like a pressure cooker. for all of the societal difficulties, which include violence and controlling and things like that, and gender-based violence. And those statistics then explode after that because of what has happened within those communities that have this impacting them. So we don't have the full data yet from this pandemic because we're still in it, but they do have data on intimate partner violence and sexual violence from Hurricane Katrina and tsunamis that impacted the population of Sri Lanka. And so we do have some data that shows a huge increase in reports of violence after these crises have happened. So what we do know is the National Alliance to End Sexual Violence has stated that across the nation, rape crisis centers have seen a 40% increase in need through the calls. And so we will know more of the statistics when we're out of this. But because of the overall fear of what's happening right now, being trapped at home with abusers, which typically 80% and higher knows their sexual perpetrator and may even live with them. And so we know that it's not safe right now. It feels unsafe to report. And it also mirrors that feeling of being trapped and not having any options. So it could be a very scary time.
You know, it's interesting how this COVID and all the restrictions has made a lot of things worse, whether it be depression, whatever, because of the isolation. Your program, like we talked about, and we'll give the exact location at the end of our podcast here, but you're out in Alliance. And we should probably mention that the program is funded by grants from the United Way of Greater Stark County and Huntington Bank. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, and we want to make sure that's acknowledged. What are some of the main services provided by your location?
With the Alliance Rape Crisis Program, we are, of course, one of the many wonderful programs through CommQuest Services. So we are housed in the CommQuest office on State Street, and we offer a totally customizable menu of service options for survivors, and it is always survivor-led based on their needs. So we offer 5 main services. Our first is our 24/7 telephone hotline, which I will give you the current number right now, but that will be changing soon. So our phone number right now is 330-821-7273, and that will be our hotline number until December 31st at midnight. After that time, January 1st of 2021, we will be combining our hotlines to make one entry point for survivor support, and that hotline phone number will be 330-452-1111. When someone accesses that phone number for support or just wanting to know next steps, they're going to have their call answered by a 40-hour trained survivor's advocate that is certified to be able to provide specific assistance to them, whether it be needing to know what to do. What do I do if I go to the hospital? How do I report this? Is there a statute of limitations? Questions like that, or just referrals and information. They can go there to get answers anytime, day or night. The second service we offer is hospital advocacy. Traditionally, we would go and be with a survivor as they get a sexual assault forensic exam completed. We would be bedside with them pre-COVID. And what we do with hospital advocacy is we provide options for them to decide on how they want to proceed forward. We do emotional support. We offer safety planning and aftercare planning. Then we provide them with fresh clothes to leave with and a bag full of supplies to help them move forward after they leave the hospital. Now we are doing this virtually by phone, but we hope to get up and running our virtual program for like telehealth to be able to serve them in that way. Our third way that we serve survivors is through legal and court advocacy, which means that we can accompany survivors if they go to the law enforcement officer and want to report their crime, or if they have court hearings, they want someone to accompany them to. The fourth way is through community education and outreach. We provide free training to members of the community about sexual violence topics. And fifth, which is a key tenet of our program, is our individualized trauma therapy. This is something that's offered out of our CommQuest office and Alliance, and sometimes it sounds a little bit scary to be going to trauma therapy, but what I'd like to clear up here today is that our trauma therapy we provide is specialized care that is survivor-led. So often what we will do is normalize exactly what someone's feeling in the wake of having a violent experience happen to them. Then we will give them information about their brain and why it's reacting the way it is. And then we'll provide coping skills to be able to manage day to day after something like that has happened. If and when they decide to process their trauma experience, we can do that as well in a gentle approach that'll help them to feel safer. Mm-hmm. But it's totally optional. We have survivors that never share their trauma story, and that's okay. We want to at least give them some support, especially now that at times we're the only people that they're seeing. During this pandemic.
That is a very large scope of services.
Yes.
Wow. If people just want some general information, what's the best place to go to find, because there's so much to consume. Where are some places that they can go?
They can go to our CommQuest.org website, / I believe it's ARC for Alliance Rape Crisis Program. So they can find that under the services we offer on CommQuest. We've got a really nice website there. Or if you're on social media, we have a Facebook page. It's Alliance Rape Crisis, all one word. We have a really great marketing team that helps us put out some really helpful information out there. This winter, we're doing the 12 Days of Boundaries instead of the 12 Days of Christmas. Okay. So stay tuned for that. We put up a lot of really good community information as well, as we're part of a large collaboration within the community, the sexual assault response team. And so we put out a lot of information for that as well. So you can find information there or just give us a call. Our daytime phone number is 330-821-8407. That's the Alliance office if you want to speak to someone during the day at the office.
Okay. It's interesting because, all this information, and it's a lot to cope with, but you throw the COVID in on top of it, and it's so much worse. With that being said, what message of hope would you have for survivors and their families? A lot of times family members know something has happened, and sometimes the person who is directly involved doesn't want the help or believes they don't need the help. What message of hope for recovery is someone who is apprehensive about reaching out for help? What would be your message of hope for those people?
We know that most of the time people will reach out to family or friends before they ever get to our program. That's just number one. We know that. And so if you're a family member or a co-survivor of someone who has gone through something like this, start by believing. You don't have to have all the answers, and they don't have to share everything, but you can offer that message. And what we've seen statistically is based on how the first experience of them sharing their story goes determines how their recovery goes. So they have a far greater chance of moving through post-traumatic stress disorder if that is the path that their mental health goes, and they can improve from that much more rapidly if they have supporters in place.
Very good. We have been talking to Gina Bowers, the Rape Crisis Program Manager and Counselor at our Alliance location, and that's located at 1207 West State Street. And just be sure the numbers I have are correct. The current number until the end of the year, as I have it, is 330-821-7273. And what will it become January 1st again?
It will be 330-452-1111, and be sure to put that in your phone, because you never know when a friend or someone may need it, and you don't want to have to Google it in that moment. So It's better to have it in your contacts now.
Gina, thank you very much. It's a sensitive subject, but you handle it so well. And that's something that our listeners should take heart in. I know a lot of times one of the apprehensions is that people won't understand what they've been through, but you guys, this is your calling. This is your purpose, and you deal with this every day. So thank you so much for coming by and giving us this information.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Gina Bowers from our Alliance location of the Rape Crisis Program. My name is Bill. This is the Hope Discovered podcast by CommQuest. To find out more, an overview, if you will, of all the things that we do, please visit CommQuest.org. Once again, that's CommQuest.org. Thank you very much for listening to our podcast today. And remember, hope happens here.